My first visit to Vegas was when I was 20, during a friend's 21st birthday party. I wasn't old enough to drink, so I had to find other means of trying to catch up with my friends. I became obsessed with trying to get one of those Fat Tuesday one bottleneck slushy drinks. Kept asking everyone who had one where they were getting it. This one guy, dressed up in a costume and passing out flyers, said he knew a place we could get one for cheap, and then we exchanged numbers, saying he would take me to get one when he was done working. He calls me, and we meet up at my hotel room. At this time, I was heavily intoxicated from drinking in my room and left without saying where I was going. He told me we had to go off the strip to get the cheapest drinks and put us on a bus. The bus ride was so long and I started to sober up. It started to get dark outside when we reached our stop. There was no one around, just a bunch of abandoned buildings. I mentioned how desolate it was, and he said everything was inside these bars, but there were no signs of any life at all. Red flags are flying off, and I started to realize that I am in a horrible position. I get a small stroke of luck as he tells me he needs to urinate around the corner and for me to wait on him. As soon as he turned around the corner, I ran as fast as I could back to the bus and got on it as it was leaving the station. It was a double-decker bus. I found a seat on top and start to feel at ease. As I'm on the bus thinking I'm safe now, I see him come up the stairs and my heart drops. He sits right next to me and then goes, "What happened? Why'd you leave?" I told him I felt uncomfortable and my friends were wondering where I was. Thankfully, my phone went off and my friends were calling me asking me where I was, and as I started to give the details, he got off at the next stop. He stared at me through the window, and that was the last time I gave my number to a stranger. Every Labor Day weekend when I was a kid, my dad would drive me, my mom, and my little sister up to Vegas for the weekend. It was surprising how many kid-friendly things there were to do in Sin City. I mean, that had to have something to entertain ankle-biters while Dad gambled away all the money at the craps table. My dad wasn't some degenerate gambler, but he did enjoy a little blackjack between our visits to Red Rock Canyons. So Mom will take us to the Disney store shopping for clothes while Dad blows off some steam. We used to have a whole bunch of Vegas traditions too. One of them was stopping off at this little place called Prima Donna Resort in a place called Prim right on the state line. We'd take a bathroom break, grab a bite to eat, and Dad would get some last-minute gambling done in the casino up there. So it's 1997. I'm 12 years old, and we just finished eating in one of the restaurants at the Prima Donna. Dad is upstairs gambling, and my sister wasn't feeling well, so Mom's attention was taken up with her. I was bored out of my mind, and I knew the vacation was coming to an end, so I guess I was just feeling restless. I got up from the boring table and wandered off into the resort. Almost immediately, my attention was grabbed by the fact that the resort had its very own arcade. I don't know how many of you remember the golden age of video game arcades. Those places were like paradise for a kid like me. I could see these two older kids screwing around the machines and not even playing anything, just like playing hide and seek or something. So I remember being way too intimidated to go look at the games. This one kid had like a plain shirt on, baggy shorts, but for some reason he had loafers on instead of sneakers, and I remember that getting my attention, thinking that it was kind of weird. Instead of exploring the arcade like I wanted to, I ended up looking around for a bathroom to take a leak. I remember seeing a little girl walk into one of the bathrooms and thinking, oh, okay, that's the girls. But then I was looking for the other door when the loafer kid walked into the same bathroom just after the little girl. I had to do a double take on the door signs to make sure I was going into the boys' room, and I quickly realized that the loafer kid did actually go into the girls' bathroom instead of the boys'. After I peed, I head back to my mom and try to tell her that someone's broken the cardinal rule of going into the wrong bathroom. But she was way too occupied with my feverish little sister to really listen to me. A few minutes later, I see Loafer's kid in the parking lot, lifting his shirt up while talking to some girls. I don't know if it was him showing off or whatever. I never figured that out, because the next thing, there's all this screaming in the lobby. I wasn't quite sure what was going on, nor did I have time to work out what happened, because a short while later my dad appeared having heard the screaming, and we ended up starting the drive back to San Diego a little earlier than expected. The next couple of days were incredibly weird. At one point, I caught my mom crying while watching the news. I asked her what was wrong, but all she did was switch the TV off really quick and hug me. I was so confused and worried, and I ended up crying too while we swapped I love yous. I knew something bad had happened back at the Prima Donna, and I knew it was affecting my parents. Just didn't quite know what that thing was, and I didn't find out until years later either. When I did, I'm glad my parents kept me in the dark about it because it's one of the most messed up things I've ever read about. And knowing it all happened just a few feet away from me is something I struggled to deal with. You see, the loafer's kid name was Jeremy Stomeyer. He was the 18-year-old adopted son of this rich family from Long Beach who'd also spent Labor Day in Vegas. I'm talking about baller money, too. Like, this kid's adopted parents were so rich that they bought him flying lessons and an actual plane. Jeremy hadn't gone into the girls' bathroom on a whim that afternoon either. He did so because he was following a 7-year-old girl named Charisse Iverson. I read that he managed to talk her into trapping herself in the bathroom by telling her it was the only place she'd feel safe from him after he chased her around the arcade for a while. Then, when she walked in, he followed her. And then when he was inside, Loafer's kid dragged the girl into a stall and put his hand over her mouth to keep her quiet and sexually assaults her. When it was over, this 18-year-old man, because that's what he was legally, took the 7-year-old girl and snapped her neck. Not just that, he makes a half-hearted attempt to conceal her body by folding her in half and stuffing her in the toilet. From what I understand, at that point, I saw him lifting up his shirt to the girls in the parking lot. He literally had just murdered a child, yet there he was flirting with girls just moments later. And that's what I found the most horrifying about it. This guy was able to act like nothing had happened. It was pretty much an open and shut case, too. Jeremy admitted to killing the little girl because she could identify him as having touched her. After the whole story unfolded, the public discovered his history of serious mental illness. I particularly remember reading about how Jeremy didn't have any trouble getting girls and how he was actually quite popular. Only some of the girls he dated were contacted by the media. They got these creepy quotes about how he used to make them dress up like little girls. I know he was facing the death penalty for a while until he took a plea deal or something. Turns out Jeremy wasn't afraid to kill, but he was afraid to die. At his trial, the judge told him that what he'd done was one of the worst crimes the judge would ever preside over, and how that he'd make sure he would rot in prison. I think that was one weird silver lining to the whole thing. Something about how couples adopting kids had a right to see the medical history of their parents. The state talked about how that would make things better for adoptive parents. But I don't really see how you can predict which kids are going to turn out to be killers. I mean, Jeremy certainly didn't look like one. Not in his baggy shorts and his loafers. He just looked like a beach bum, not someone who's capable of killing a kid. It's 3 o'clock in the morning at an isolated Las Vegas intersection on the 22nd of February 2017. On any other night, the only people that might be around would be a handful of homeless folks trying to make themselves as comfortable as possible in their beds of concrete and gravel. But on this night, they have company. The intersection is often visited by representatives of homeless outreach programs, but the person joining them tonight isn't interested in helping them. He's there for one reason alone: to kill. The homeless residents of Las Vegas are particularly vulnerable since Nevada is one of the 4 western states, along with California, Hawaii, and Oregon, in which over half the homeless population do not reside in shelters or temporary housing. Instead, they live on the streets or in vehicles, parks, tunnels, and other places unfit for human habitations. 2 homeless men have already been murdered at this same location, surrounded by freeways far from then the lights of the Vegas Strip. Both were bludgeoned to death with a blunt object, and the perpetrator has once again returned to hunt. A hooded figure is pacing back and forth in front of a pile of blankets that have the distinct shape of a sleeping person beneath them. In the hooded figure's hand is a claw hammer, 4 pounds of molded steel designed to bash and tear through timber and brick. The figure raises the hammer above his head and it fixes his gaze to where he believes his sleeping victim's head is. Then, with both hands gripping the hammer's rubber handle, it brings the blunt side of the steel head down hard. But the sounds that echo through the chilly Nevada night is not the one he has become accustomed to hearing. It is not the crack of a broken skull, rather something else. What's more, there's no darkening of the blanket around the victim's head from blood being soaked up by fabric. 30-year-old Shane Schindler has gone out that night to take the life of a homeless person, but instead, the end of abusing his hammer on nothing more than a plastic mannequin. As his confusion begins to register, Schindler's blinded by the beams of flashlights that seemingly come out of nowhere. Hidden police officers reveal themselves, pointing their weapons at him and demanding that he drop the hammer. Schindler does as he's told, tossing the prospective murder weapon aside before lying face down in the dirt. As officers restrain him and handcuffs click around his wrists, Schindler realizes that he is falling for a rather ingenious sting operation. The operation was masterminded by a Las Vegas police captain, Andrew Walsh. As I say every time the homeless person is murdered, the sidewalk or a soft patch of dirt is no place for a human being to take their last breath. We took those crimes very personally. They're the lost faces of our community, he told a gathering of journalists after Schindler had been arrested. At a press conference, Walsh explained that he had instructed his officers to place a series of human decoys on the ground in the area where the homeless killings have taken place. The bizarre tactic came after having absolutely no luck in the investigation. They had no witnesses, no motive, nothing to point them in the direction of the murderer. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Once the decoys were placed, police officers used a mix of hidden cameras and plainclothes detectives to keep an eye on the bait. And it was one of these plainclothes detective units that watched as Shane Schindler attacked their plastic mannequin. He was immediately arrested and charged with carrying a concealed weapon without a permit, a charge which would buy detectives the time they needed to make a murder charge stick. Schindler's defense attorney claimed that the concealed weapon charge was entirely trumped up. He asserted that carrying a hammer in a bag was not a crime. Otherwise, every construction worker and carpenter in the country would be arrested for the exact same thing. But luckily, the police managed to keep him in jail, where the judge, having agreed that the damage done to the mannequin was enough to confirm that Schindler intended to kill someone that night. Then all it took was linking Schindler and the hammer attack to the two other homeless bludgeonings that occurred the weeks before. It was practically an open and shut case, and Schindler took the advice of his defense attorney, taking the attempted murder plea deal offered to him by state prosecutors. If he chooses to fight the charges, he could well end up being sentenced to death. And so a Nevada judge sentenced Schindler to 8 years for attempted murder. Although it's worth noting that this is simply to buy time for Vegas police to put together an airtight murder charge against him so that the homeless population of Las Vegas can hope to taste a measure of justice. Little is known about the other two men that Shane Schindler is believed to have murdered, but we do know that one of them was a 60-year-old man named Daniel Agape. Daniel had only been living on the streets for around 4 months in January of 2017. He still kept in touch with his family, who he called every few weeks so he could catch up with them. But one day it simply stopped. Daniel had become Shane Schindler's first victim. At the very same intersection at which he was arrested, a 40-year-old homeless woman named Stacy Carney told journalists that the murders had rocked her impoverished, tight-knit community. She mentioned how they were terrified, shocked to the core by something that sounded more like a horror movie than a reality for them. But all of the interviewed homeless were deeply thankful to the Vegas cops who organized the mannequin sting. Staying with Stacy herself, saying, "I think it's really cool how they set up that dummy to catch him."